On the night of June 18, 2014, in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Jacksonville, Florida, what started as an ordinary evening quickly spiraled into a tragedy that would send shockwaves through the community. Harold Matthews, a retired police officer and a well-respected member of the neighborhood, was found brutally shot in his own living room. But as investigators dug deeper, they discovered that the truth was far more disturbing. Harold Matthews was not just the victim of a random crime, he was caught in the crossfire of a personal vendetta fueled by secrets and lies. At the heart of this tragedy was Jennifer Matthews, Harold's 35-year-old daughter-in-law. Jennifer was known in the community as the perfect suburban housewife, devoted to her family, always keeping her home in order and making sure her husband, Mark Matthews, had everything he needed to succeed. Mark, a successful real estate agent, was known for his charm and his ability to close deals. His job often kept him out late, attending networking events or showing properties, leaving Jennifer to manage the household. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, a dark secret was festering. Jennifer and Harold had been involved in a secret affair, a relationship that had been carefully hidden from the rest of the family. This affair, fueled by lust and betrayal, had been simmering for years, creating a toxic environment that would eventually lead to Harold's untimely death. Detectives uncovered a trail of evidence that pointed to a crime of passion, a deadly confrontation that had erupted when the truth about the affair finally came to light. Jennifer, feeling trapped and desperate, had taken matters into her own hands, leading to a confrontation with Harold that ended in violence. The once peaceful suburban neighborhood was left reeling from the revelations. A family that had appeared perfect on the outside was now shattered by betrayal and murder. Harold's death was not just a tragedy, it was a grim reminder that even in the quietest of neighborhoods, dark secrets can fester and explode in the most violent ways. In the end, the story of Harold Matthews serves as a chilling cautionary tale about the dangers of deception and the devastating consequences that can arise when the truth is buried too deep for too long. In the Matthews household, Jennifer's life revolved around caring for their two young children, Emma and Lucas. Her days were filled with school runs, keeping the house in order, and making sure everything ran smoothly. But in 2008, tragedy struck. Harold Matthews, Mark's father, lost his wife to a long battle with cancer. Harold had always been a man of few words, a trait honed by years of service as a police officer. But the loss of his wife devastated him in ways he couldn't conceal. No longer the stoic figure he once was, Harold sought solace in the comfort of his family, spending more and more time at Mark and Jennifer's home to fill the void left by his wife's death. Jennifer, always compassionate, made it her mission to support Harold during his time of grief. She invited him over for dinners, preparing his favorite meals, and patiently listened as he reminisced about the life he had shared with his late wife. To Jennifer, this was simply the right thing to do, especially since Mark was increasingly distant, consumed by the demands of his job and the pressure of providing for the family. However, Harold found more than just comfort in Jennifer's presence. What began as a simple act of kindness gradually turned into something more complicated. The first time Harold looked at Jennifer, with an emotion other than fatherly affection, it took him by surprise. It was a chilly evening in December 2009. After dinner, as they sat on the porch, Jennifer wrapped a blanket around Harold's shoulders. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, something unspoken passed between them. It was just a spark, but it was enough to plant a seed of something neither could ignore. As the months went by, the tension between them grew. Jennifer found herself eagerly anticipating Harold's visits, more than she should have. She would catch herself daydreaming about him, only to push those thoughts away, filled with guilt. Harold, too, was conflicted. He knew it was wrong. Jennifer was his daughter-in-law, the mother of his grandchildren, but the emotions he had kept buried since his wife's death were resurfacing, and he couldn't control them. By the spring of 2010, their relationship took a fateful turn. One evening, while Mark was away on a business trip, Harold stayed late at the house to help Jennifer fix a leaky faucet. The children were asleep, and the house was silent. As they worked together in the kitchen, their hands brushed against each other. In that quiet moment, Harold acted on impulse. He leaned in and kissed Jennifer. Jennifer pulled back, shocked by what had just happened, but the kiss had ignited a flame within both of them, a flame that couldn't easily be extinguished. They didn't speak of it that night, but the air between them was heavy with the knowledge that something had irrevocably changed. Over the following weeks, they tried to avoid each other, attempting to convince themselves that nothing had happened, but the attraction between them was too strong. By the summer of 2010, they could no longer resist. Their encounters became more frequent, and each one was more daring than the last. They were careful, always meeting in secret. Harold's house when Mark was out of town, or in secluded spots in the city where they wouldn't be recognized. For years they carried on the affair, fully aware of the consequences but too deeply entangled to break free. Harold felt alive again, something he hadn't felt since losing his wife, while Jennifer found in Harold the emotional connection that Mark no longer provided. On March 2, 2014, Jennifer and Harold met at a rundown motel on the outskirts of Jacksonville, a place they had stumbled upon by chance months earlier. The motel, with its peeling paint and faded sign, was far enough from the city to minimize the risk of running into anyone they knew. It was the perfect place for their clandestine meetings. They had been using this motel for their secret rendezvous, always paying in cash and using fake names to avoid leaving a trace. On this particular Sunday afternoon, as the sun began to set, Jennifer parked her car in the gravel lot, her heart pounding. She checked her phone one last time to ensure there were no missed calls or messages from Mark. Satisfied, she slipped the phone into her purse and stepped out of the car, trying to steady her nerves. Harold was already there, waiting. He had checked in earlier under the name John Smith, a name so ordinary it was almost comical, yet effective for their purposes. When Jennifer entered the room, Harold greeted her with a brief smile, but there was something different about him this time, a tension in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. They had been meeting like this for years, yet each encounter carried the looming threat of discovery. At first, they talked about the usual things, how the kids were doing in school, Mark's latest real estate deals. But it didn't take long for the conversation to shift to the affair. Harold had been contemplating ending it, worried that they were tempting fate. Jennifer, too, had her doubts, but the thought of losing Harold terrified her more than the risk of getting caught. She tried to persuade him that they could continue, that they were being careful enough, but Harold wasn't convinced. After their meeting, Jennifer drove home, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and desperation. When she arrived, she found Mark sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. He didn't look up when she walked in. His expression was distant, and there was an unmistakable tension in his posture, the way his jaw was clenched. Jennifer noticed but didn't press him about it, assuming it was just stress from work. What she didn't realize was that Mark's suspicions were starting to take root. Unbeknownst to Jennifer, Mark had been observing changes in her behavior over the past few months. She had become more secretive, frequently finding excuses to leave the house. He had even caught her on the phone a few times, hurriedly ending the call as soon as he entered the room. Mark wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the signs were there, and he could no longer ignore them. That evening, as Jennifer went through her usual routine, making dinner, helping the kids with their homework, getting them ready for bed, she tried to push her worries aside. But a nagging feeling persisted, a sense that the carefully constructed facade of her life was beginning to crumble. It was a typical Saturday afternoon when Mark stumbled upon the key that would unravel the illusion of his marriage. Jennifer had left her purse on the kitchen counter while she was out in the garden with the kids. Mark, searching for some cash to pay the lawn care guy, reached into her purse. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a key. Puzzled, he pulled it out and examined it. It was unfamiliar, not for their home, car, or any property he was aware of. As he held the key, a creeping suspicion that had been gnawing at him for months began to take hold. Why would Jennifer have a key he didn't know about? Mark's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. But he didn't confront her right away. Instead, he slipped the key into his pocket, deciding to investigate further before making any accusations. As the days passed, Mark couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. He began watching Jennifer more closely, scrutinizing her every move as they went through their daily routines, dinner with the kids, putting them to bed, and then settling on the couch to watch TV. Although Mark's behavior had changed, Jennifer either didn't notice or chose not to acknowledge it. Mark's paranoia grew with each passing day. He started checking Jennifer's phone whenever she left it unattended, scrolling through her messages in search of anything suspicious. But Jennifer was meticulous, deleting any incriminating texts or call logs before Mark could find them. However, the key he had found was a different matter, a physical clue, something tangible that he could investigate. On March 22, 2014, while Jennifer was out running errands, Mark took the key to a local locksmith. The locksmith, a man in his late 50s with a graying beard, examined the key carefully. "This is for an older lock," he said, turning it over in his hands. "Not something you'd find on a new property, maybe a motel or an older building." Mark felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. A motel key. Why would Jennifer have a motel key? The answer seemed obvious, but Mark needed concrete proof. By April 6, 2014, Jennifer and Harold had started meeting less frequently. The discovery of the key had made them both wary, and the fear of being caught loomed large. Yet the pull between them was too strong to resist, and they arranged another meeting at the same rundown motel they had used for years. It was a rainy Sunday evening when they arrived, both tense and on edge. They sat across from each other at the small, rickety table, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. Harold absent-mindedly fiddled with his wedding ring, a habit he had never been able to break, even after his wife's death. Finally, Harold broke the silence. His voice was low but firm as he told Jennifer that it was time to end the affair. He expressed his growing concern about the dangers they were courting, emphasizing that they were playing with fire. "It's only a matter of time before someone finds out," he warned. Jennifer's eyes widened with fear as she looked at Harold, struggling to accept the idea of ending what they had. She cared deeply for Harold and was terrified of losing him. But despite her feelings, Harold remained resolute. He sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. He acknowledged that he cared for Jennifer too, but the risks were too great, especially if Mark or the children were to discover their secret. He reminded her that, although they had been lucky so far, luck was not something they could rely on indefinitely. The conversation grew heated, with Jennifer pleading for them to continue the affair, while Harold insisted that they stop before they destroyed their families. The tension between them was palpable, each of them torn between their desires and the harsh reality of their situation. On April 10, 2014, Mark made a decision that would change everything. He decided to hire a private investigator. He had never done anything like this before, but the doubts and suspicions had been gnawing at him day and night. The investigator he chose was Tom Grayson, a former cop known for his discretion and thoroughness. They met at a small diner on the edge of town, far from anyone who might recognize them. Tom listened carefully as Mark laid out his concerns, nodding thoughtfully as he took notes. After hearing Mark's story, Tom assured him that if Jennifer was indeed involved with someone else, he would uncover the truth. Mark handed over a manila envelope containing photos of Jennifer and the motel key, his hands trembling slightly as he did so. "I need to know the truth," Mark said, his voice strained under the weight of the situation. Tom accepted the envelope, promising Mark that he would have answers soon enough. For the next week, Mark's anxiety grew as he awaited news from Tom. He tried to go about his daily life as usual, but the uncertainty gnawed at him, making it impossible to focus on anything else. He knew that whatever Tom uncovered would either confirm his worst fears or provide him with the relief he desperately needed. But deep down, Mark feared that the truth would be far more devastating than he could imagine. As the days passed, Mark's anxiety only grew stronger. He tried to act normally around Jennifer, but the tension between them was palpable. Jennifer noticed his odd behavior but attributed it to stress from work, completely unaware that her every move was being closely monitored. On April 18, 2014, Tom delivered the evidence that Mark had feared. Photographs of Jennifer and Harold taken just days earlier showed them entering the motel together. As Mark flipped through the images, his heart sank, each photo a painful dagger to his already wounded pride. There was no denying it now, his wife was having an affair with his own father. Despite the rage boiling inside him, Mark kept his composure. He needed to think, to plan. Confronting Jennifer or Harold in the heat of the moment could lead to a disastrous outcome. The evening of May 2, 2014, was unusually quiet in the Matthews household. Mark had been holding on to his rage for weeks, waiting for the right moment to confront Jennifer. Dinner was a silent affair, with the children chatting about their day while Mark and Jennifer exchanged only the bare minimum of conversation. After the kids were tucked into bed, Mark decided it was time. He called Jennifer into the living room, his expression stern and unyielding. Sensing something was wrong, Jennifer sat down on the couch. Without hesitation, Mark pulled out the photos he had gathered and threw them onto the coffee table in front of her. His demand for an explanation was cold and controlled, leaving no room for denial. As Jennifer looked at the photos, the color drained from her face. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized how much Mark knew. She tried to speak, to explain, but Mark cut her off sharply. He made it clear that he didn't want to hear any justifications, demanding to know how long she had been sneaking around behind his back with his father. Jennifer broke down, sobbing as she confessed everything. She begged for forgiveness, swearing that she still loved Mark and that she had made a terrible mistake. But Mark was beyond hearing her words. He stormed out of the house, leaving Jennifer alone with her guilt and fear. He drove for hours, his mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and a thirst for revenge. When he finally stopped, he found himself outside Harold's house. The sight of the familiar home filled him with rage. He pounded on the door, and when Harold answered, the confrontation erupted into a violent argument. Mark accused his father of the ultimate betrayal. Harold, caught off guard, tried to defend himself, but Mark's anger was uncontrollable. The fight turned physical, with both men grappling before Mark finally stormed off, vowing revenge. The fear that Mark might act on his threats haunted Jennifer. She had never seen him so enraged, and the memory of his outburst left her shaken. She confided in her closest friend, Sarah, a woman she had known since college. They met at a small cafe on May 15, 2014, where Jennifer poured out her heart, revealing the affair and the confrontation with Mark. Sarah was in shock, her expression a mix of concern and disbelief. She urged Jennifer to leave, warning her that Mark was dangerous in his current state and that there was no way to predict what he might do. Jennifer, however, was torn. The idea of leaving Mark meant not only ending her marriage but also uprooting her children's lives. She expressed her fears and uncertainty to Sarah, admitting that she was scared but didn't want to cause any harm to the kids. In response, Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Jennifer's hand, emphasizing the need to protect herself and her children. She stressed that if Mark was as angry as Jennifer described, she needed to be prepared for anything that might happen. Jennifer nodded. But deep down, she wasn't sure she could go through with it. She felt trapped, paralyzed by her guilt and fear, unable to see a way out. Meanwhile, Mark's anger festered, consuming him day by day. He couldn't shake the images of Jennifer and Harold together, and the more he thought about it, the more he wanted to make them both pay. By June 5, 2014, Mark's thoughts had turned darker, and he began to meticulously plan his revenge. He purchased a gun from a shady dealer on the outskirts of town, a transaction that was quick and untraceable. Mark knew enough to cover his tracks, making sure there was no connection between him and the weapon. He stored the gun in a locked box in the garage, hidden beneath a pile of old tools and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. Each day, as he went through his normal routine, Mark's thoughts were consumed with the details of his plan. He rehearsed it in his mind repeatedly, envisioning every step, every possible outcome. The day of reckoning had finally arrived on June 18, 2014. Mark had been biding his time, waiting for the moment when he was certain Harold would be alone. That evening, after watching Harold enter his house alone, Mark decided it was time. He retrieved the gun from its hiding place, carefully placing it into a bag along with a pair of gloves. As he drove to Harold's house, the gravity of what he was about to do pressed heavily on him, but it was overshadowed by his overwhelming need for vengeance. Mark arrived at Harold's house just after 8 p.m. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the front yard. He parked a few houses down the street, far enough away to avoid drawing attention. With the gun concealed under his jacket, Mark approached the house, using the spare key he had taken from Harold years ago. The lock clicked quietly as he turned the key, and he slipped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Mark moved silently through the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Harold sitting in the living room, engrossed in a book, unaware of the danger lurking just a few feet away. Without hesitation, Mark stepped forward, pulling the gun from his jacket. Harold looked up, his eyes widening in shock as he recognized the figure before him. There was no time for words, no chance for explanations. Mark raised the gun and fired twice. The shots echoed through the empty house as Harold slumped back in his chair, the book falling from his hands and blood pooling beneath him. Mark stood there for a moment, staring at the lifeless body of the man who had once been his father. There was no satisfaction in the act, only a cold, hollow feeling settling in his chest. He quickly set about staging the scene, wiping down the gun and placing it in Harold's hand, arranging the room to make it look like a struggle had taken place. Mark was meticulous, ensuring that nothing could link him to the crime. The next morning, Jennifer was at home preparing breakfast for the kids when there was a knock on the door. Startled, she opened it to find two police officers standing on the porch, their expressions grave. The sight of their uniforms sent a wave of panic through her. "Mrs. Matthews?" one of the officers asked, his tone gentle but serious. Jennifer confirmed with a trembling voice, "I'm sorry to inform you, but Harold Matthews was found dead in his home early this morning. It appears to have been a robbery gone wrong," the officer said, watching her closely for a reaction. Jennifer's world seemed to tilt on its axis as the words sank in. She gasped, her knees buckling as she leaned against the door frame for support. The officers moved quickly to steady her, helping her inside. Overwhelmed by shock, Jennifer could not speak, her mind reeling from the news. The police officers, sensing her distress, asked if there was someone they could call, but Jennifer just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. The realization that Harold was gone, that the man she had shared so much with was dead, was too much to bear. The investigation into Harold's death began immediately. The initial assessment by the police pointed to a botched robbery, but something about the scene didn't sit right with lead detective John Harris. He had known Harold from his days on the force and knew the man was no easy target. There were too many inconsistencies and unanswered questions. As the police interviewed friends and family, the truth about Jennifer's affair with Harold began to surface. It wasn't long before the private investigators' photos, which had been stored among Harold's belongings, were discovered by the detectives. The affair added a new layer of complexity to the case, and suddenly, the robbery theory seemed less plausible. Mark was brought in for questioning on June 25, 2014. He had prepared himself for this moment, knowing that the police would eventually come knocking. His alibi was flimsy at best. He had been home alone on the night of the murder with no one to corroborate his story. The detectives, sensing his discomfort, pressed him on the details, asking questions that Mark struggled to answer convincingly. When they searched his car and home, they found the gloves he had worn on the night of the murder, hidden away in the garage. Though cleaned, the gloves still had traces of gunpowder, linking Mark to the crime. It was a small piece of evidence, but it was enough to crack Mark's carefully constructed facade. Facing the mounting evidence, Mark's carefully built facade began to crumble. Mark's composure began to crumble as the detectives pressed him with relentless questioning. At first, he denied everything, but the detectives' methodical approach broke down his defenses. The reality of his situation, the truth of his actions, began to weigh heavily on his mind. By July 3, 2014, the police had accumulated enough evidence to arrest Mark on suspicion of murder. The once proud man, determined to exact revenge, was now a broken figure, his face pale and haunted as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. Charged with first-degree murder and held without bail, Mark faced a future bleak with little hope. Meanwhile, Jennifer was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The man she had once loved had become a murderer, her father-in-law was dead, and the affair that had seemed like an escape from her troubled marriage had led to unimaginable tragedy. Determined to protect her children from the fallout of Mark's actions, she filed for divorce. Mark's trial began on August 15, 2014, with the prosecution presenting a strong case against him. The evidence was damning. The affair, the gloves with gunpowder residue, and the inconsistencies in his alibi all pointed to his guilt. Photographs from the private investigator were shown in court, painting a picture of a man driven to the edge by betrayal and jealousy. The defense attempted to argue that Mark had been temporarily insane, driven over the edge by the affair. However, the jury was unconvinced. The cold, calculated manner in which Mark had carried out the murder left little room for sympathy. On September 10, 2014, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed by his own actions. As Mark was led away in handcuffs, his once promising life lay in ruins, destroyed by the very revenge he had meticulously planned. Jennifer, devastated by the events that had unfolded, moved out of Jacksonville with her children. She sought a fresh start, hoping to leave behind the horrors of the past. Yet the memories of the affair, the murder and the trial would haunt her for the rest of her life.